We interrupt this incredibly awesome music to bring you some incredibly awesome political talk on Damn Radio.
Hello, good morning, welcome, Merry Christmas, and all of that rot. Everything that I would normally say, like here I am live, coming to you live from the Lake Ozark Real Estate of the Art Studio. I suppose I'll say it. I'm coming to you live from the Lake Ozark Real Estate of the Art Studio. Studio. Feel free to phone in 573-746-8020 and wish me a Merry Christmas, because it was merry. And also, you might feel the urge to send in an email to live@damradio.com. You can send an email to me, Samuel T. at internationalflavor.com. We have a new organization built. The website is only partially done for our new 501c3, which is called Civic Outlaws. And we are accepting donations and doing some very cool stuff. And there are some state folks that are already frightened of what we have been able to accomplish against them. And I think I might even read it to you today. We received the most ridiculous sunshine law demand. Okay, if you start pushing, guess what they do? They push back. If they don't comply, all right, and by the way, if they come after you and you are asked for information and you don't comply, oh, it's the end of the freaking world. They give a new charge if you're Samuel Edward Trapp. You know, you get a new charge in your ridiculous Missouri bar charges from a corrupt individual who wanted you to go after Greg Williams and you refused, and so he came after you instead for virtually something that was much less than Greg Williams did, but he came after you anyway and then dumped on other stuff. And why? Because you are failing to cooperate. But they put a law out there that says the government should be open. They should have open records, that we should get to do things. And we have received from them, and now they're bitching and complaining. We've already provided 3,600 pages of records. And you know what it costs us to get that 3,600 pages of records? More than $5,000. And now we've requested so much that this letter is friggin' hilarious. I might share it with you today because but I want to get to some other stuff because we did have some big international news. But I certainly this week I will. I haven't prepped that sort of show yet, but I plan to. And so keep an eye on Civic Outlaws because we have only just begun. Reminds me of the Carpenter. Shall I sing for you? We've only just begun to live. I should start crying when I do it because Karen Carpenter, you know, she always sounded like she was virtually in tears or very close to it when she sang their song. Anyway, I'm babbling already. Here, look at me already. Haven't spoken to you since before Christmas. And now here it is, a few short days after Christmas. It's been maybe a week. Well, it's not even been a week because I did Monday and Tuesday, I think. Yep, I sure did. So it's I did miss a few shows, and I had planned to do them, and I just opted not to, you know, and I really needed the break. If you'd like to call in, 573-746-8020. I do plan to get into Maria Zakharova, Trump and Zelensky, some Lavrov news coming up. He's supposed to give an annual press briefing, and, you know, Putin does one every year, and they have that before too long. I discovered when my visa expires, and I'm really a little pissy about it because I got to go pretty soon or not go at all. To get over there, I've only got 60-something, 65 short days remaining, and I got to get my fat butt over there in the winter. I really wanted to do that because I've been there in the remains of winter, but not really cold, and I really wanted to do a New Year's trip. And if it didn't take so long, I'd leave like right now, to fly over there. But it's a long flight, and it's a long flight back, and so I hope I don't miss out on the boat entirely. Man, I really am all over the map, and I've got some stuff to get to as well. That we watched. I might play a little bit of the Trump-Zelensky presser that was last night, but I think I'd prefer to start with Maria Zakharova. Every Friday, she gives a briefing, and usually this is like a Friday ritual, and it's a 2-hour. She's the spokesperson for the Ministry of Defense, works directly for Sergei Lavrov, and it's always gives the weekly press briefing. And so everything that I'm about to tell you came from her Christmas Day press briefing. And it was interesting. It's the last one of the year. The next one won't be till after the New Year, New Year's Day or whatever it is on the 1st. And I'm not sure there will be one, but it won't be until the new year either way. So this is the last one of the year. And basically what she did was go over some of the things. She did talk about Lavrov's yearly press brief, annual state of affairs, that kind of thing, which will come up to us in mid to late January, she says. I'll be keeping an eye out for that. And she was talking about certain themes, and there's no particular order to this for me. She did in a particular order, but I split it out in the way that I thought it might make a little bit more of a flowing sense for us, especially from the point of view of the war in Ukraine, the Zelensky Trump meeting coming up, which was quite contradictory, shall we say. And Trump is already giving, and it's not excuses because it's not his war to end, but he is giving, what do they call it? Managing our expectations is what he's doing. He is managing to make sure that we don't say, but you told me X. You told me, and there's some contradictions certainly in the way that these are framed. But I thought what Zakharova was saying was quite interesting, and I think that, and I watched another one. I keep track of Mr. Trump gave us some interesting numbers in his presentation with the Z Monster yesterday, and he said that there's a very small percentage that want to continue the war, and and that's true. And he gave a number. And I wish I could remember what it was. Maybe we will listen to that part, but I want to say it was like 20% or less. But Zelensky doesn't have any backing right now, and there are plenty of reasons for that. The Ukrainians are certainly tired of this, and there's a little bit of what I found quite interesting was that Zakharova and Arestovich, who I've told you about before, the two of them are coming to the same results on a few things, but for different reasons. So I definitely want to plow into that a little bit later in the show. And I do want to let you know that I believe Monday, Tuesday, and probably Wednesday is New Year's Eve. I'm not sure if we're going to have a show on New Year's Day or not. I'm not sure of that. And there's a slight chance that I may be traveling somewhere, and I might do the same thing this week that I did last. And so those shows this week don't follow the schedule necessarily, at least for me. But you will be able to get all of my shows on internationalflavor.com. Just like always, I've thought about putting up a couple or doing some live on a different platform, my Podbean platform, because you can go live on there too. And it's when I'm traveling, maybe a little more stable, and do it there and then record it here or something like that. So they may not be live, but these are live to you in the mornings. I'm usually live, yes. And so I want to talk to you about Zakharova. She talked about the IOC, International Olympic Committee, decision to allow youth Russian and Belarus athletes little bit of a crack in this artificial wall that's been placed, of politicized exclusion of Russians from, we've never done that. They didn't do that to the Nazis. They didn't do it to them, but we do it to everybody else. Her argument isn't really celebratorial. It's fatalistic. The Olympic Charter cannot indefinitely survive being bent into a sanctions tool. I mean, that's true. You can't twist it all up as some kind of a world organization that doesn't represent the world. And if you don't include Russia, it's a very bad plan. Russia shows very well at most of the Olympics, and excluding them or telling them they've got to participate only under another flag is foolish, number one, and it's not what has happened in the past. It's just not. People haven't been kept out of that Olympic Games. They are. If anything, they're a non-political show of, Ukrainians beating Russians, maybe, give them an opportunity to beat them in a different sphere or something like that. And so she contrasts this IOC incremental return to, foundational principles that she calls it this. And I found the word, this was very appropriate. She calls it cave-level Russophobia among EU officials. And Denmark's culture minister is her example of a broad pathology. These are politicians with zero sporting authority that attempt to dictate who can compete and under what conditions. These are people who never competed a day in their lives on anything except how much money to put in their bank account, and they're certainly not sportsmen. And her claim is pretty blunt. Banning athletes does not punish the government. It destroys the sport itself. And that's, kind of what she said. And she said, if you want your athletes on the podium, you don't do it by banning others. You do it by developing sports. Now, that's a very smart approach, what she said. She also said the full restoration of Russian athletes' rights is not a question of if, it's only a question of time. And both of those, are things that are directly that she said, and she's correct. She's absolutely correct. And it's Western governments are weaponizing everything. And they're weaponizing apolitical institutions, supposedly apolitical, and those institutions are trying to claw their way back to some sort of credibility, especially after the joke of Olympics that occurred this past summer. In 2024. What a joke. You got all it was a transgender party, and that's nonsense. I hate to rat out one of my sons, but I was with two of them over the little break that I had there at Christmas, and we traveled and we talked, and one of them has a friend from high school who has decided, and it was his best friend in high school, who decided that he is transgender. And I met him one time, and I was nice. I didn't say anything. I don't like that, and I especially don't like it if it's some kind of a drama scenario, or you're taking attention from somebody's very special day and putting it on yourself. You can't for one day just attempt to put somebody else's day ahead of your own. And I just find that to be so selfish. I just, that you have to, you can't, and I could comment on some more, but I really don't want to on that topic on this, but we did get into on that part of it anyway. But we got into the times that I don't care if you want to, wear your Christmas story bunny rabbit suit all over the planet. If that's what you'd like to wear it. I don't care if you want to wear women's, underwear. I don't care what you wear. I laugh at some of it. You see some pretty ridiculous outfits at Walmart. And have you ever seen the fashion of Walmart things on YouTube? I think they've taken a bunch of them down and gotten rid of them, but oh my God, there's some frightening photos of all of that stuff. Caught at Walmart or something like that was what it was called. And some of those things were just so frightening, right? What people are wearing. And at any rate, we had a discussion about this, and I said that the only times it really bothers me is actually are three that are closely related. The first is you're going to be your desire, right, whatever you want to call it, right to be different impacts someone else's day to be normal. Perhaps you're having a graduation, perhaps you're having a wedding, and you want to invite them. But if it's me and it's a wedding, I'm inviting them and saying, look, I really don't want you here because this day isn't about you. It's about me. And if you wish to, if I'm the one getting married, and if it's me, I'm saying, look, I think you should just give it a rest for a day, please. Please don't come. I'm asking, I'm not inviting you. You are not invited because I don't want this. So if somebody expressly desires that it's their day and not yours, please don't mess up my day by doing X. I think that's one example. Number two, you don't go teaching kids this if people are over 18, and you don't normalize it for them in schools by having transgender teachers and all of this rot, so that your kids decide that it's cool, or they teach them that it's cool against what you are teaching. Those things belong in the family. That's number two. And number three is probably the most important for me. Women have fought for years to be in sports, and they have fought for this, right? And now what are we doing? We've taken it away. But not we, sure as hell ain't me. And but these assholes that want to come in and take, some failing wrestler who couldn't wrestle his way out of, a chicken coop, or a male chicken coop, is going to go in and beat a bunch of girls, kickboxing champions, beating the crap out of women, knocking them flat in seconds because they're stronger, bigger, faster. And those are the realities of life. And I don't believe that it should be allowed. You want to have a trend? Here's the joke of it all, right? If you took men in one group, women in another group, and created a third group of transgender men, or if you wanted to have men's bathrooms, women's bathrooms, and transgenders' bathrooms, I could support that. And I'm not against someone's ability or desire to be transgender or claim they're, I don't know what, a different sex. It's not a mental. I believe it is a mental condition, but it's not a mental decision. It's a biological decision. You may think you're a woman and your body might, but your penis says otherwise. If you're and vice versa. Now, I don't give a crap about gay. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. I give a rip. and if you want to be gay. But this transgender stuff that is taking over the planet, I dislike, and for those three reasons. Now, you can beat up on me over that, but that's my point of view, and I share that point of view with a number of people. And I believe it's fair. Women fight to have sporting events, and then they can't even win in something because some man comes in and steals their day, steals their thunder, steals their ability to compete. And I have the exact same thing with taking a field and narrowing it by artificial means. If women wanted to compete, if a woman decided that she wanted to be a man and she's going to take testosterone and say that she can compete against men, great, more power to her. I think that's foolish because she's going to get her ass handed to her. And I don't believe that's anything to do with testosterone. Okay. And the same is true for men wanting to go the other way. I imagine if you had a third category, transgenders or, call it confused, men, women, and confused, put them in there, then it would be all biological men because the women would be in the same boat. They would prefer to be on the side of the women, and they'll dress up in men's clothing and be a transgender man. But if they're going to be in sports, they're going to go on the women's side because they wouldn't win on the men's side. Now, there may be minor exceptions to that, things like archery or something like that. Who knows? But in the physical sports, swimming, individual sports, shot put, stuff that require huge upper body strength, pole vaulting, figure it out. Running, the difference between men and women in a marathon is at least 12 minutes. The average is 12 minutes. That's for the fastest of men, that is literally 3 miles faster. And so, at any rate, that's enough about that. But these apolitical institutions trying to dictate what we believe, what we think, what you believe, and to demonize certain types of people. They'd demonize me if they heard what I just said. And there's other, juxtapositions, of this war rhetoric and soft power, that certainly were brought about by Maria Zakharova. She spent some time on the Alexandrov Ensemble international tour and emphasized the packed halls, local officials in attendance, and performances in national languages because they say the same thing. There's a lot of propaganda, but you can't let a Russian ensemble show up. You can't let the Russian ballets show up. You can't, this is bad. You can't have them show up. You're sanctioning them. You're sanctioning culture, which is idiotic. And she says, these things, that these performances that show up to packed halls and stuff like that, it's not nostalgia. It's rebuttal of the idea that Russia is isolated. Her argument was that culture travels where sanctions cannot, and that audiences are separating government from civilization. I thought that was a pretty astute claim. She ties this to humanitarian aid, food assistance to Africa through UN World Food Programs. The point she hammers is consistency. Russia speaks about global South development and then writes checks and ships food and backs it up. They're doing it. These performances are not Russian propaganda. They are shared human values, was her quote. And humanitarian aid is not charity, she said. It's a responsibility. So it's kind of a parallel reality, sanctions politics versus global engagement. Russia is not cut off. Which one shapes long-term influence? You think it's keeping somebody out of the Olympics is not going to shape it? Sure is. But if you participate, in these food programs and things like that, you are creating a different world. So Germany, here's some sanctions. They were talking about there's some petty authoritarianism that she's been bringing on to. This was a pretty emotional section of her press conference, and rightly so. She talked about multiple cases of German customs authorities seizing the personal belongings of Russian citizens, clothing, cash, gifts, under the pretext of sanctions enforcement. So there were stories about them traveling abroad for Christmas and stuff like that, and the horror story of flying into Germany and being it'd be the equivalent of the anal probe here, you know what I mean? Stealing their stuff and seriously harassing these travelers. And her claim wasn't that it's a legal overreach, but it's a moral degradation, humiliation, shouting, intimidation, and expectations that victims won't pursue remedies because, they're Russian and they live abroad. She calls Germany a territory of lawlessness for Russians and advises Russian citizens to avoid travel there unless absolutely necessary because, the Gestapo's about. And she said they robbed this one woman in broad daylight and called it compliance. And when it comes to Russians, human rights suddenly do not apply. This was a brutal takedown for her, that this entire show. That's why I'm sharing it with you, because, it's, talk about the broader discussion about selective legality, how, our so-called democracies justify behavior that would be condemned instantly if done the other way around. If this happened to me when I traveled to Russia and the Russians, were stealing my gifts and calling, me names and treating me poorly just because I'm an American, I've been questioned every time. Why are you here? What are you doing? Sometimes pretty detailed. And especially while the war part has been going on. Before that, it was pretty straightforward. Who you coming to see, why you here. You got to register at whatever hotel you're in and that kind of thing. Little details that they talk about. And want to make sure that you're coming to comply with the law and you're not coming to do anything clandestine or ridiculous. But they're not stealing your stuff. They're not anal probing you. They're not doing anything that they're not doing to any other person for a security part of the state. And that's not what's going on in Germany, and there's other places too. And Zakharova was pretty brutal about it. And she talked about Latvia and the arrest of a guy named Viktor Gushkin and Gushkin, I think. Well, I don't remember exactly how to say it. And the repression that goes on in the Baltics. I told you that from my trip there this past fall, that place is it's frightening. They are very much anti-Russia. You can't even speak Russian in the Ubers. They go crazy on you, and they don't like it. And it's like, Jesus, I'm hiring you. I'll speak whatever language I feel like, And she now, this Viktor Gushkin is a historian and Russian community leader, and they arrested him, and she calls it political intimidation, not law enforcement. His academic and cultural work, and the case of him is a warning shot about Russian-speaking population. She references Gestapo-style tactics, suppression of dissent, ethnic targeting. She situates Latvia within the broader Baltic pattern, not as an outlier, but as a test case for how far EU members will go against Russian minority populations. It's not justice, it's intimidation. 80 years after the victory over Nazism, its shadow is returning to Europe, is what she said. And, this a serious conversation about minority rights inside the EU, especially when those minorities are just, inconvenient, Same thing going on with Norway and fisheries. They're attacking fishing in Norway and Russia and the sanctions and treaties. She's like, it's technical international law. She accuses Norway of undermining decades-old bilateral fishing agreements by so-called EU sanctions against Russian companies with no evidence. Fisheries management in the Barents and the Norwegian seas is a shared ecological responsibility, and they have politicized it, and it's risking the collapse of a system that has worked very well for more than half a century. She warns that Norway is surrendering its political and policy sovereignty to Brussels and acting against their own long-term interests. I found this extremely interesting. She said, this is not solidarity with the EU, it's abdication of responsibility. And who benefits from destroying a functioning system? You know, how do sanctions spill into environmental governance? You know, it's, you know, without, and then she talked about the shadow fleet and the abuse of maritime law. And I found this very interesting because the law is definitely on her side. And it folds into a little bit that I'm going to follow up with on Trump and this nonsense going on in Venezuela. Zakharova, you know, dismantled this term shadow fleet. And she said it does not exist in any sort of international maritime law. It's a made-up term. And it's completely ridiculous. It has never existed before. If a ship sails under another country's flag, you can't say that it's really Russian. You know, that's not how it works under the law. And they're just making these things up. And so she argues that the EU has, and the U.S. too, because they're starting to do it too, has been retrofitting legal language to justify ridiculous actions, inspections, detentions, seizures, pressure that would violate the United Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, I forget what the C stands for, particularly the freedom of navigation. And all of these invoke it, and what Trump's doing violates it too. And she invokes mare liberum, and liberty on the sea, and accuses the EU of doing what it historically condemned, bending the law to match the power you wish to grab. And she invited European legal scholars to explain publicly what they think the term actually means, since definitions keep shifting. And the term shadow fleet exists nowhere in international law, and it's a legal distortion, not valid enforcement. And it's, tell you what, I did a little bit of a deeper dive into customary maritime law several weeks ago when Trump started this nonsense, and we were talking about the Russian alleged shadow fleet when they were seizing stuff on the Black Sea. And crazy stuff. Poland is seizing Russian property. Zakharova addressed reports of Polish appropriating former Russian diplomatic properties, specifically in the city of Gdansk. And her position was that the property belongs to Russia under post-war agreements, and any attempts to seize it is illegal. And she said reciprocity will absolutely follow. And she said, we advise Warsaw to calculate the consequences. She talked about cultural revisionism in Ukraine. She spent a good amount of time to Ukraine's removal of more monuments and renaming historical references and Ukrainizing everything, and claiming that Ukraine and not Russia developed these, these history parts, and they got rid of the Great Patriotic War. You can't even call it that anymore. And she argues this is not de-Sovietization, but cultural amputation, and extends even to figures like Tchaikovsky and Bulgakov and other artists and other authors. And, she's talking about erasing of shared culture, and you erase shared memory as well. And how is that going to reconcile these two places? It's not. And so she said you can't build a future by erasing civilization. And, memory politics, cancel culture, and the weaponization of history is exactly what you see. And she spent a little bit of time on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as the target of state-sponsored repression, which used to be the Russian Orthodox Church. They made them change the name to Ukrainian Orthodox Church to get rid of the Russian reference, and then told them they couldn't be subordinate to any, to the Russian hierarchy, but even though they were the exact same church. Just in Ukraine, they're called Ukrainianism. And she calls it a rival structure that's a political instrument, and they've been targeting everybody. And, there are court delays, international concern, and manipulation to argue that mass religious changes forced upon you by government that she says these are there, and Ukraine, of course, is saying this is false, and this has nothing to do with faith, to God. It has to do with control by the government, just like everything else. Religious freedom, just like everything else in Europe, is selectively enforced or selectively defended. Depending on who you choose to align with. She spent a long time talking about Western financing sustaining Ukraine's war economy, but not Ukrainian society. This is a big deal, and this is where Arestovich talks some as well. She highlighted desertion, which is huge, forced mobilization, public statements admitting systemic failure of their system. The money flows through Ukraine, she says, not to Ukraine. It enriches networks and individuals and exhausts the population. The population don't get any of this. Then the Westerners are funding the war until the last Ukrainian, and then they are asked, the oligarchs that are left are asking for more. This is precisely what's happening now. Over the weekend, Zelensky was begging for more money, too, said we don't have enough money. They had 12,000 bodies returned, and they can't afford it. It's crazy. It's Russia gets like 20 bodies back, that have been killed by Ukrainian forces, and then Ukraine receives 12,000, and they don't want them because they cannot afford the payment that has to come to the family when the bodies are identified. Everybody gets 200,000-300,000, whatever that number is, and it's approximate, and that they get in hryvnia, which are the Ukrainian money, but they equate to right around $260,000 to $300,000, and they can't afford it. And we'll get further into that when we talk a little bit about what Arestovich was talking about over the weekend too, and talk about the Trump Zelensky meeting. She was talking about civilian casualties inside of Russian territories, and she listed regions, dates, weapons used, victims by age, including children and infants. This is not an accident. She always does this, and she does it at least once a month. And, that they keep talking about, the differentiation between frontline and rear, and that Ukrainian strikes, especially drone attacks, are not collateral damage, but are deliberate terror tactics, because they aren't attacking oil refineries except once in a while. They are attacking civilians in border regions and major cities. She repeatedly uses the word terrorism and reinforces it by citing criminal prosecutions of people. They talked about some more. And there was a number, I want to say it's 278 children that have been killed by the Ukrainians since the war began. And this is how Kiev treats children, she said. These are not military targets. These are acts of terror. And she's laying the groundwork for legal, not just military, escalation. Sanctions narratives are reversed into criminal liability, There's high-profile assassinations and internal sabotage. There was a killing of a senior Russian military official with a car bombing in Moscow. She points the finger with restraint, says that Ukrainian special services are definitely suspected. And this escalation method, once assassination enters the capital, the conflict is not geographically containable. She links this to Western intelligence backing without naming the agencies. The investigation is ongoing, but the method speaks for itself, was what she said. And she talked about foreign mercenaries and individual criminal liability. There was a Swedish, British, an indictment of Ukrainian drone operators. It's short, But she talked about it. She said nationality won't shield these combatants from terrorism charges, and Western passports are not diplomatic immunity. And she says responsibility will follow on the battlefield and in court. And so she's, they're trying to deter private military volunteers and contractors. She talked a little bit about EU frozen assets and the illusion of reparations. And this is why you're not going to have a settlement, because this, first of all, let's talk about the EU's 90 billion loan plan, that Ukraine's not going to pay it. The EU knows Ukraine isn't going to pay it. And frozen Russian assets are being eyed to cover this gap. And they, everybody, including me, calls it theft, not policy. Zelensky's statement that Ukraine would only repay the money, the 90 billion that they're receiving, he's already saying we're not going to repay it, and we'll only repay it if Russia pays reparations, is a moment of his accidental honesty. The guy's never honest. And her deeper argument is demographic and generational. European taxpayers and their children will pay this debt. There was talk that it's $3.8 billion a year just for Germany to pay the interest on the loan for their part. And it's a debt for a war that doesn't benefit them. And so, that's who's going to end up paying this back. This isn't assistance. This is robbery dressed as solidarity. And they will never see this money again, is what she said. And I mean, you can't not agree with her. You got to agree with her. It's because she's speaking the truth. And she talks about this loan discussion and argues that the war is now a financial ecosystem, not a defensive effort. The Ramstein format commitments, Ukrainian defense budget that exceed domestic capacity, expectation that Western states permanently fund Ukrainian military spending, which is exactly what they're asking for. We're on the Eastern Front against these big bad Russians. Well, you shouldn't have been killing their people then. You should have behaved properly and not said, oh, geez, we don't have to worry about them. They're Russia. They'll collapse in a heartbeat. They didn't, did they? Her claim is that the money cycles back through corruption networks. Same old folks getting rich off of this through all the corruption, the contractors, the intermediaries. Did you hear that Zelensky was hit again with another scandal? Corruption. Nobody talks about this stuff here in the West. You don't see large articles about it here and there. No. But there's another scandal that's been outlined. And here we are funding this. They're not funding peace. They are funding the circulation of more Western money and the theft and putting into the hands of other people, because everybody gets their share. And, this money laundering under humanitarian branding. You get a call, oh, geez, we got to save Ukraine. Go ahead and take my money. Give it to them. Why? All they're going to do is steal it. It's not like the people in Ukraine are getting any of it, because they're not. And the people that are getting it are the same old assholes that always get it. And they have this mobilization crisis. Their people, soldiers aren't getting paid. There are plenty of stories of that. Mobilization crisis and social breakdown. The Ukrainian society has been bled dry, not mobilized. The desertion statistics are extremely high. Their last numbers that I saw were some 300,000. Criminal penalties are replacing consent. Officials are admitting the internal failure, both in the Verkhovna Rada and in political newspapers and commentary. She cites a Ukrainian commentary that admits people choose prison over death. People are choosing jail over the front line. That tells you everything. They would rather go to jail than go to the front line. And this is mobilization is not patriotic. It's a coercive extraction. These people are being just sent out to slaughter. And it's really a horror story. The things that Donald Trump was saying yesterday in his in his part of the briefing were absolutely correct. They something needs to happen, but he's afraid it's not going to. The Russian Orthodox Church issue, Zakharova emphasizes legal mechanisms, on that. And she talked a little bit about Venezuela, the Caribbean, and maritime hypocrisy, and she condemns U.S. naval pressure around Venezuela, and because it also breaches the UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Principles of Free Navigation, and the EU is silent on this, or worse, the EU is trying to do the same thing on Russia's shadow fleet. So her argument is maritime law is enforced selectively depending on whose ships are involved. But she says, here's her quote, "Piracy is piracy, even when done by a powerful state." It's a good comment. It's naval coercion dressed as enforcement is still naval coercion, right? So it was a very interesting brief that she gave, and there was quite a bit interesting in there. And I wanted to segment that a little bit into the Trump-Zelensky press conference. It was 23 minutes long. I'm just going to summarize it for you because there's a core reality. Everybody pretended that this was, momentum, and this is not momentum. This is the same. We've had momentum all year long, right? But there is no momentum. Nothing has come of this, and nothing will come of this either. Nobody believes this momentum, include probably Trump himself doesn't, because he was hedging his bets on it. This was framed as some sort of progress, but the substance betrayed, the theater of it all, the camera opportunity. Trump used optimistic language, so did Zelensky. 95%, we're there, we're very close, we're almost agreed. I always told my kids horseshoes only counts in horseshoes, atom bombs, and hand grenades, right? Because you can get a point for being close in horseshoes. You can get close with a hand grenade and still blow something up, and you can get fairly close with an atom bomb, and you'll still kill the target. But close only close, but no cigar. But there was and Trump didn't, he was asked this a couple of times, refused to name a single resolved strategic issue, any of these 20 points. Remember, Trump had a 28-point plan. Zelensky provided a 20-point plan with the same old nonsense. And Trump acknowledges that, and he said it in the briefing. And he said that he had a 2.5-hour conversation with Putin the day before. And, he had spoken with him about this, and he said there isn't going to be a ceasefire agreement. There can be a peace agreement. And Zelensky comes out and says the exact same thing he always has. We won't agree until there's a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire. Russia says we don't want a ceasefire. There is no ceasefire agreement. Territorial issues are not resolved. The referendums are hypothetical. They act like they never occurred. And talks will fail within the next few weeks. And Trump said the same thing. And the referendums about, and the funny part is you can't, Zelensky says he has to have an election and a referendum, okay, in order for them to agree to end the war, right? That he can't just end it. He needs a referendum. He needs elections. And if you stop the war, we'll have elections. And Russia's saying, well, why can't you have elections without the war? And, these things, there's no ceasefire, the issues, the referendums are hypothetical. They're never going to happen, in other words. Trump says this. And then these talks, he did say these talks, could fail entirely within weeks. And they said, what happens then? He said, well, they continue fighting. And that alone tells you everything. If the war's core questions, land, sovereignty, security guarantees, sequencing, are unsolved, then nothing has moved. So, I had a conversation on Telegram with a journalist lady that I met in Kazan last year, and the same one that interviews me on her television program time to time in Russia. And she sent some things to me, and we were just wishing each other Happy New Year and Christmas and all that. And by the way, it's important to note that in Russian culture, New Year's comes first, and then Christmas comes, because they celebrate Christ's birth according to a different calendar. I forget what it's called. I can't remember. Gregorian? I don't remember. But they celebrate, the Orthodox calendar has the birth of Christ occurring on the 7th of January. So they have it the opposite. We're about a week before New Year's. They're about a week after New Year's. So our time between December 15th and 30th, we never get anything done. And for Russia, it's between the 1st and the 15th. They never get anything done. The place is basically shut down. Anyway, she was talking to me about that, and I told her, sent her Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. She said, our Christmas is still, a week away. I was like, I understand that. It just, she reminded me, so I thought I'd remind everybody else, because we say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year at the same time. They don't. They have New Year's first and then Christmas, and New Year's is non-sectarian, and Christmas, of course, is quite religious. But she told me that she expects nothing from the Trump and Zelensky visit. It's just going to be the same old crap, is what she said. She said it's going to be the same old crap that we've been hearing the whole year. Nobody has paid any attention to the root causes. And, we had, naturally, I feel the same way. This is going to be the exact same thing as Trump and Putin's call. He talked about Putin's call versus Trump's Western optics. The most revealing moment of this entire thing, of this 23-minute press conference with the Z Monster, was when Trump contradicted the Western line himself. He said, Putin does not want a ceasefire first. And he actually said he can understand that. He said, I understand why. And it's the same thing that Putin told him in August in Alaska. And can you believe it was that long ago? Putin believes stopping and restarting war is far worse than continuing it. And Trump understands that position. And he also, Putin explained again to him why this stopping and restarting, because it gives the Ukrainians time to regroup, everybody in the West time to resupply. This is the exact opposite of Zelensky's demands, EU rhetoric, and the media framing that is constant. So you're having two parallel conversations, one with Putin about an end to the war, and one with Zelensky and Europeans about the process. These two are not compatible, and it's not gonna end. And this goes back to what Zakharova said. She said a ceasefire without a political resolution is not peace. It's time to rearm, reorganize, reset on the battlefield. And Trump acknowledges that, whether intentionally or instinctively. He knows that this is not going to get anywhere, because the Zelensky will never do it. And Zelensky's latest performance, latest show stopper. He gives language and just follows along with zero leverage, zero anything. His remarks were, critically procedural. Although he was a little more polished, and he's making sure to talk about, the diplomacy and thanking the president now. And he spoke about his 20-point plan, security guarantees from the West, the framework, referendums, and sequencing. None of these exist without enforcement power. And there is no enforcement power. The moment that gave the game away for me was when they talked on the referendum discussion. Zelensky insisted that any deal had to be approved by parliament or public vote. And Trump openly doubted whether this was feasible or even necessary. And Putin, per Trump, rejects the ceasefire condition tied to a referendum. This creates a political impossibility. It's a triangle. Russia won't stop fighting for a vote. Ukraine won't concede land without a vote. The West wants a ceasefire first. This is a stalemate, all of it, and dressed as dialogue. And the questions asked at the end of this conference tell the real story. When they talked about territory, he was quizzed about territory. Trump admitted that land has been taken, it's up for grabs, and much more may be taken soon. This is an extraordinary admission from the U.S. president. On the ceasefire, he said it's explicitly rejected by Russia, acknowledged by Trump, and ignored by Zelensky, who keeps saying, I want a ceasefire. And Trump concedes that talks could collapse completely on any sort of timeline. They're going, do you expect anything by the end of the year, by this or that? On enforcement, Europe is expected to take over security. This is all vague and undefined and unrealistic because Russia won't put up with it. And on reconstruction, Trump claims that Putin would help build Ukraine, rebuild. This is a claim that immediately collapses under sanctions reality. None of these are answers at all. And so why does Russia, why does Zakharova, why does my friend from the newspaper, Anna, why does she believe that nothing is going to come of this? Because Zakharova keeps detailing civilian casualties being blown up inside of Russia, forced mobilization in Ukraine, religious persecution that's continuing and hasn't been dealt with, cultural erasure of Russia, war financing and corruption that continues, fully apace, legal manipulation on sanctions, maritime law, property seizure. So from Moscow's perspective, the question isn't how to pause the war, it's why the war exists at all. And she says, you cannot negotiate peace with a system that profits from war, criminalizes dissent, erases culture, and treats ceasefire as a logistics break. So Russia sees all of these talks as process and political theater. And Trump knows this, because he's spoken with Putin, and his language actually leaks it. His optimism, is he has to be optimistic. What else is he going to do? But he keeps qualifying it. He says, if it goes well, if it goes poorly, it may not happen. I don't like to put percentages on things. And what happens if they don't finish? They keep fighting and they keep dying. This is not the language of a man who thinks a resolution is imminent. This is the language of somebody that's managing our expectations, and he quietly shifts responsibility. Europe has to take over security. U.S. is tired of this. Ukraine must approve concessions, and they never will. Russia must want it badly enough. In other words, if this fails, it's not on him. And he mentioned again this talking about this war wouldn't have happened if I was in office. And he's probably right. I could give him that. That's probably accurate. And, however, he was funding this stuff too, this escalation. And I believe it may have just delayed it some. But, this is the bottom line on all of this is this meeting with Zelensky and Trump, yet again, this is no peace breakthrough. It's a public alignment exercise designed to show activity. We're trying, we're getting something, but there's no resolution. Trump knows Russia will not stop without an end state, an end game guarantee. And Zelensky can't accept an end state without political cover. He's got to, keep they can't lose. He can't be seen to have lost. Europe wants a pause. They don't want peace. Europe just wants to rearm before 2028, and then they'll jump in. That's what they're spending all the money for, is they're hoping to continue to come after Russia. And everyone in Moscow knows this. And so Zakharova's horror story of all of this isn't rhetoric. It's a strategic indictment on why these talks have been stalling for the last nearly a year, and they will continue to do so. So once again, we watch the same discussion, the same promises, the same optimism, and the same absence of reality. Peace isn't blocked by bad faith. It's blocked by two incompatible goals. And anyone who's serious about this already knows it. So it's not gonna happen. One of these where there was a referendum question that nobody wanted to touch, one of the most revealing moments of this Trump-Zelensky presser, didn't come from what was said. It came from what was carefully not said. So after the speeches by the two and the commentary and several questions, Zelensky was asked a legitimate, practical question. If there were ever a referendum connected to a peace settlement, would Ukrainians who fled the country be allowed to vote? And his answer was yes, but he focused narrowly on Ukrainians living in Europe, Poland, Germany, other EU states. He didn't talk about the U.S. and the logistical difficulty of building a voting infrastructure in those countries. This answer is extremely telling, not because it's wrong, because it's extremely selective. What he did not address, and the reporter didn't follow up on it, is the existence of millions of Ukrainian passport holders currently living inside of Russia. Many of them in territories that changed hands during the war, many of them displaced, evacuated, resettled, relocated under circumstances that are politically inconvenient for Kiev. And they never talk about it. They won't answer the question. And now the West doesn't even ask it. And this silence is a big deal. If the principle being invoked is the land belongs to the nation, not to the person, Zelensky's own words, then the nation doesn't suddenly stop existing at the Polish border, right? Or the Russian border. Either Ukrainians abroad are citizens whose voices must be heard regardless of their location, or the referendum isn't about democratic legitimacy at all, but it's about controlling the electorate, or continuing to control the electorate inside of Ukraine, or the electorate, or what result you want to get inside of Ukraine. There is no third option. It's just like the voting in Moldova, where they didn't let the Transnistria people, they didn't have as many voting places. And if anybody from Moldova was in other countries, they weren't allowed to vote in Russia. They had 3 whole polling stations, and they had like 18, 20 in Italy. Remember that? So there is no third option. They're either have to be heard, or it's a scam. And so from Moscow's perspective, and this is precisely the argument laid out by Maria Zakharova, the selective framing just reinforces their belief that any referendum conducted under current conditions would be engineered, for procedure. It wouldn't be a genuinely representative vote. And a neutral international law standpoint, you can't help but talk about this omission, because but if you do, you know that it brings up all sorts of uncomfortable questions. Are Ukrainians in Russia excluded by geography, by politics, or their expected voting behavior? If participation is limited to acceptable places or people, can the result ever be called legitimate? And why is no Western journalist willing to ask the obvious follow-up question to, what about those in Russia? How hard is that to say? The answer is simple, because the answer would complicate the narrative in the West. Oh, yeah, we're trying to follow up on democracy. Ukraine's democracy. My ass, Ukraine is not democratic, no matter how you slice it, anyway. And they sure as hell aren't going to be democratic here. So a referendum that includes Ukrainian in Europe but excludes Ukrainians in Russia would immediately expose this process as political theater as well, not self-determination. And so that's why the question was allowed to die quietly in the room. And Zakharova talked about it too. Ceasefires are proposed without end state clarity. Democratic mechanisms are invoked selectively, and peace processes are framed to look legitimate but avoid outcomes that might contradict Western expectations. If you're serious about a vote, you don't pre-screen the voters, and if you do, don't call it democracy. So the one unanswered question that they had may be the clearest indicator that once again, nothing real is ready to happen, because the moment reality intrudes, the conversation stops. That's what happens. This is reality. I wanted to talk a little bit about a murder that occurred years ago on a guy, but I'm going to skip that and maybe get to it later in the week. I wanted to get to, if we have enough, we have enough time, because this isn't a long spot at all. But there's I'm pretty cynical about this, and here we are again. Nothing's changed on Trump, Venezuela, and the fantasy of this legal violence. So let's, immediately take the varnish off of this. What's happening with Venezuela is not law enforcement. It is not counter narcotics. It is not counterterrorism. It is not international order. It is raw power politics dressed up in a legal, cosplay uniform. And it is one of the most intellectually dishonest maneuvers that the Trump administration has engaged in. This is nonsense. The rhetoric sounds tough. The posture looks decisive. The legality of it all, however, is non-existent. And that is not an opinion, friends and neighbors. That is fact. Okay? The core lie is that they are redefining a state as a criminal gang. The foundational maneuver here is pretty simply, it's just breathtaking. Mike Waltz says on camera that the U.S. does not recognize Nicolas Maduro as the Venezuelan president, that Maduro is a fugitive from American justice, and that Maduro leads a foreign terrorist organization called the Cartel de las Solas. Therefore, using military force against Venezuela becomes a law enforcement operation. This isn't legal reasoning, people. This is BS. This is crap complete. If the U.S. can unilaterally declare that a sitting government is a criminal organization, that a sovereign territory is a crime scene, and military action is just a police raid, then there is no such thing as international law. There's no such thing as a UN mandate. There's no Security Council authorization. There is no claim to self-defense. There is no imminent threat to anyone. Just a declaration. And suddenly, war is policing. This isn't rules-based order. This is rule by assertion. We say it's the rule, therefore it's the rule. The same thing we've done a million times before, not under Trump. But here we are again. This is how the Lindsey Grahams of the world win when they lose in Ukraine. You give them something else to cheer for, right? You give them some other place to go that isn't going to be so politically difficult. That's what I say. And, if you can back off in Ukraine and cut them off, but take over another country that pisses you off, well, Lindsey Graham will always be happy, And Mitch McConnell, they love that stuff. The UN drug report fraud. Yes, fraud. Fraud is what I said. Here's where it crosses from hypocrisy into downright dishonest commentary. Waltz says that the UN World Drug Report of 2025 identifies Venezuela as the central trafficking hub in the Western Hemisphere. This claim is demonstrably false. Anyone can verify this with a basic search and can read the UN document. The UN document mentions Venezuela only Twice. Once as a geographic listing and once as the nationality of one of the contributors. There is no designation whatsoever of Venezuela as a central trafficking node. None. The actual trafficking maps emphasize Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Mexico. So this was not a misreading, a difference of interpretation, or a debatable conclusion. This is a complete fabrication delivered calmly into a camera. And that matters because false legal predicates are how we are beginning wars these days. How about this? We don't need legal authorization. This is a quiet confession. One of the most revealing moments in the discussion is thrown away casually. We don't need legal authorization. We are the maker of the international rules-based order. This is not a slip. This is doctrine. It's the same doctrine we used for Iraq, Libya, Syria, Panama, Kosovo. The law is not something we follow. It is something we invoke when it's convenient, and we discard it when it's obstructive. And Trump, despite his anti-establishment branding, is leaning fully into this tradition. This is not populism. This is empire building with a little bit better marketing. That's what this is. And people need to come to grips with this. We are going to war for what reason? Oil, and oil alone. These other reasons are all BS. And we're doing it for oil. Well, I shouldn't say alone because regime change. But the regime change is to get the oil and to keep it from China, Russia, to keep it from BRICS nations, and to control South America, the hemisphere that we said we are going to control because we got Pete Hegseth, who is going to make sure that this is what happens. Follow the master, right? So what's the military reality? This is power theater, not power. Now comes the second illusion, the belief that force equals control. Yep. 15% of the U.S. Navy can sit offshore Venezuela right off. And yep, they can launch strikes. And yep, they can block the ports of Venezuela. And then what? Then what happens? Venezuela is 3 times the size of Vietnam. It's got a dense jungle, mountainous terrain, porous borders with Colombia and Brazil, established guerrilla and smuggling networks. You can blockade the ports, but you can't blockade geography. The U.S. could not secure the road from the airport to Caracas, prevent insurgent resupply, control border flow, protect logistics lines. This isn't conjecture. This is Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, replayed with worse terrain and less legitimacy. And what is the final of this? The kill the leader delusion. At the heart of Trump's approach is the same failed fantasy. Kill the guy on the top and the system collapses, even if you put in this Nobel Prize winning person, which is what they would do. We have a 20-year case study, probably longer, proving these things wrong. We have Saddam Hussein dead, and what happened? Insurgency exploded. Libya, Gaddafi dead, Libya is disintegrated. Hamas leaders are dead, but Hamas persists, doesn't it? Hezbollah commanders dead, Hezbollah is still around, isn't it? Leadership decapitation does not end systems, it radicalizes them further. And Venezuela's institutions, corrupt or not, are not going to evaporate because we kill Maduro. If anything, killing him will guarantee civil war, competing power centers, and long-term instability, as well as anti-American armed resistance. And this will lead to the ugliest truth that Trump has a real problem here, just like the Biden and him, Trump claiming he'd get it done in one day, and he had to make some pretty bad admissions that isn't the case. His real problem is he has no exit ramp. He ran for president this second time on ending war, avoiding regime change, not repeating Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Libya. And yet here he is recreating the exact same structure, which I say is the exact same mistake. He has either no or very vague objective. What is the objective? To put this other lady in power? He has no post-conflict plan. He has no political settlement framework, nothing, and no legitimacy mechanism. What is it? We're going to force you to do what we want you to do by putting our ships off the coast. If Maduro survives an initial strike, Trump looks weak, escalation is the only option, and domestic support will collapse. I don't think he has any domestic support right now anyway, except from the diehards who think he can't do anything wrong. This is wrong. This is stupid, and it's yet another example of Lindsey Graham's of the world running crap for you. If Maduro dies, we get insurgency, high casualties, and a war he promised not to fight that will begin anyway. Every single branch of this leads to failure. This is not strategy, not remotely. It is hubris. It is, I can do this, I can do anything. This is, no, you can't. And I believe Ukraine has shown that. The international consequence, this is another consequence. Why nobody believes the U.S. anymore. Russian and Chinese responses included in the program, in response to this, is they do matter because the message is simple. You accuse us of violating people's sovereignty all the time. Then you redefine sovereignty so it doesn't exist. You accuse us of aggression, but you label your own aggression law enforcement. At some point, they don't even argue anymore. They just ignore you. And this is why Russia and China are deepening their military cooperation. This is why BRICS is expanding. This is why alternative financial systems are growing. And this is why the U.S. moral authority is collapsing or already has collapsed, because this is our history, at least since the collapse of the Soviet Union, arguably before that even. And it isn't collapsing because everybody else are saints, because they're not, but because U.S. hypocrisy is just so visible and quite explicit. I'm very cynical about this all the time, and this. I don't distill the truth for you. I don't do it at all. I say what I believe to be true, and that is how I approach things. This is not about drugs, not remotely. This is not about democracy, not remotely. By the way, the bombings of boats by the, blowing up people that are allegedly trafficking drugs, that's not about drugs either. Not remotely. That's about showing power. So it's not about drugs. It's not about democracy. It sure as hell isn't about law. This is about preserving the illusion that American power can still dictate outcomes by declaration and declaration alone. And Trump isn't breaking from this system that has been in place for a long time. He's revealing it as still alive and well. That's what's happening. And Venezuela is not a solution to this. It's another future indictment. You can't kill your way out of Venezuela, and pretending you can is not strength. It's the same delusion that burned every presidency, that created a victim in another country, every presidency before this one that did the same exact thing. It's this is how it is, I tell you what, this is a confession, really. The segment does make me angry. It's not ideological, but legally, I'm angry about it. Because what we're watching unfold with Venezuela, this is not even remotely foreign policy or counter-narcotics. It's not even imperial overreach, It's, if it was, it'd be dressed up very badly, but it's actually something far worse. It's the ritualized destruction of law, performed calmly, confidently, and with the expectation that nobody's going to challenge it. Because we're not. And if you care about legality at all, not just when it's convenient, then what the U.S. is doing right now toward Venezuela is just indefensible. And it truly is. Let's see. There is no provision in the UN Charter, customary international law, or any recognized doctrine of self-defense that allows a state to unilaterally redefine another sovereign government as a criminal gang and then use force against it. None. Under Article 2, subparagraph 4 of the UN Charter, states are prohibited from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. There are only two exceptions. UN Security Council authorization under Chapter 7 and self-defense against an armed attack under Article 51. Venezuela has attacked neither the United States nor its territory. There is no Security Council resolution, so legality is dead before the first ship ever moved, right? We already talked about the fabricated evidence that they had. The report, doesn't rank or say anything about Venezuela. This is exactly the same thing, these false predicates that invalidate legal justification, just like they did with Iraq's weapon of mass destruction, Libya's imminent massacre of people that never occurred, Syria's constantly shifting red lines. Once you tolerate these lies, the law is the theater. The use of force doctrine, this is illegal even if Maduro is guilty. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Maduro is corrupt, criminal, and morally bankrupt. I don't care if he is or is not. Not my problem. That still does not authorize invasion. International law does not permit regime change, punitive expeditions, law enforcement, war, or leader decapitation as a policy. The International Court of Justice in Nicaragua versus the United States made this explicit. Political, economic, or ideological grievances do not justify the use of force. That's the International Court of Justice. And targeted killing of state leadership outside armed conflict violates prohibitions on aggression, sovereignty, and due process. Calling it counterterrorism does not change that. And no U.S. law saying otherwise applies. You can't do it that way. Now let's, the U.S. Navy positions itself. Here's where this hypocrisy is like unbelievable. It is under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Blockades, suspensions, and interdictions violate freedom of navigation. Blockades are acts of war, and interdiction without armed conflict or UN mandate is illegal, yet the U.S. does this routinely. Routinely. Maria Zakharova's argument about this on the so-called shadow fleet, her point is devastating. The term shadow, like I told you, the term shadow fleet doesn't exist in international maritime law. There's no legal category under UNCLOS that allows vessel seizure based on ownership suspicion. Sanctions enforcement on the high sea, not allowed. Reclassification of commercial shipping as criminal enterprises. And yet the West does exactly that all over against Russia, against Venezuela, and they pretend that maritime law still exists. Crazy. So here's the contrast that should embarrass Washington. When Russia challenges vessel seizures, sanctions enforcement, invented legal categories, Western governments say international law has to be respected. But when U.S. does the same thing, declares a government criminal, declares a blockade as law enforcement, declares force as pre-authorized, suddenly the law becomes flexible. That's not a rules-based order. That's rules only for people you describe as enemies. So Zakharova's maritime argument isn't pro-Russia, it's pro-law. And the U.S. position on Venezuela proves her point better than her commentary ever could. You know, the strategic reality is you can't enforce the law with bombs. Even if you ignore legality, the strategy is delusional. Venezuela is massive. The jungle terrain, the porous borders, the armed population, external backers, blockading ports, smugglers adapt. Kill Maduro, insurgency begins, and somebody else will take over. Occupy the territory, political collapse follows. Every historical example confirms this. You know, you don't need me to tell you this. What's the truth that I hate admitting more than anything? And I'm a cynic, but I still hate admitting this. The U.S. no longer even pretends that law constrains its acts internationally. The law is now an exercise in branding, a justification tool, and a disposable narrative. And that's corrosive, not just internationally, but domestically. I'm not alone in thinking this, friends and neighbors. I am not alone. I'm not trying to convince you either. You can believe what you want. If you believe that, oh, gee, this is good for the United States. Really? This is not good for us. There are huge problems because once you accept lies as a legal predicate, force as policing, police work, and sovereignty as optional concepts that depend on who gets to claim the sovereignty, you don't get to complain when others do the same thing. And why this should terrify you? Why? I tell you what, we're coming toward the end, so you can't defend international law by violating it first. You can't preserve order by redefining war as arrest. It's police work. And you can't claim moral authority while inventing the legality on the fly. What's happening in Venezuela is not a show of strength. It's the end stage behavior of a system that no longer believes that its own rules apply to it. It only can be applied to others, and it's flexible for us. And that, more than any rival state, is what should really scare you. When law becomes a costume, power doesn't even pretend anymore, and history will not forgive that. It's not going to forgive it. I tell you what, I had a little bit more to go into about the military strategy in Goyapoya because the lines are collapsing all over the place. What's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine is, if you want to understand another reason the Trump-Zelensky meeting isn't going to go anywhere, stop listening to diplomatic language and look what's really happening tactically, institutionally, and on the front lines. The collapse of Ukrainian battalion command post in Goyapoya is not isolated. It is another case study on manpower shortage, exhausted units, command dysfunction, which translates into battlefield failure. And we could go into, what matters to Goyapoya, but it's all towns, it's everything, and it makes the Trump-Zelensky meeting pretty damn hollow. The discussions revolved around ceasefire, referendum, sequencing, and guarantees, but none of these address what's happening on the field. You can't negotiate from a position where fronts are held by understrength territorial units, command posts are overrun by a patrol-level force, officers fear punishment more than defeat, mobilization produces resentment, not resilience. So this is why Trump's comments on acknowledging that Russia doesn't want a ceasefire without end-state guarantees are more honest than Zelensky's, optimistic procedure-based discussions. And Moscow's point of view, echoed by everybody, Zakharova, Arestovich, a ceasefire under these conditions would do one thing: freeze a collapsing Ukrainian defense long enough to reorganize and rearm. And that is why Russia rejects it. While diplomats talk about framework, Ukrainian battalion headquarters are being overrun, documents are captured intact, officers are killed or punished for surviving, and entire sectors held by exhausted territorial units. This is not negotiating position. It's a warning sign. Russia sees no incentive to pause, and Trump knows nothing decisive will come out of this meeting. I hope you join me every day this week, or I hope every day this week, here on International Flavor. Thank you very much for being here, and I hope you have a very good day, and I will see you tomorrow.